On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. His shooting prompted a major rash of violence throughout America. And after he died, there were over 40 deaths throughout the country and major riots in over 100 American cities. Indianapolis was not one of them. In Indianapolis, Robert Kennedy gave a speech announcing the death of King Jr. on the day that he was shot, while also encouraging the upset crowd to seek peace, love, and compassion amongst their fellow citizens rather than revolt. In that calm and sincere and empathetic speech, after all, Robert Kennedy had lost a family member as well, so he understood how they felt. But it's often been credited as a major reason why the city of Indianapolis never broke out in riot. It also serves, though, as a great lesson for us today of how King Solomon was right when he wrote, way back in Proverbs, "A soft answer turns away wrath." When people are emotional and when they're angry and adrenaline filled, we need voices who are able to calm and still and speak peace into that situation. Some seem to have a knack for making those types of situations better, while others have a knack for making them much worse. For those interested in American history and Indianapolis history, the story of Bobby Kennedy may be familiar to you. However, we're not here to rehearse American history. We're here to learn from Bible history. And so I want to notice with you here tonight a Bible example of an unsung and an unnamed hero. It's a heathen, actually. It's not a Christian. But he's an individual who calmed down a situation which was headed toward violence and chaos. And this individual is the town clerk at Ephesus. And we read about him in Acts chapter 19. And so if you want to turn to Acts 19, we're going to camp there for a while tonight. Think about this text as we consider, first of all, that situation that was in Ephesus. The town clerk was somebody who calmed down the riots. Before we start to think about that riot, I just want to give you a little bit of background information about Ephesus itself. The whole chapter of Acts 19, it's about the conversion of the Ephesians. The city of Ephesus was a major city, and the work in that city was very important. It was important because Ephesus was the market of Asia Minor. In those days, trade followed the river valleys, and Ephesus stood at the mouth of the Cayster River, and therefore it was a city of major wealth and of importance in trade. It was given the nickname of the treasure house of Asia. It was a wealthy city. Ephesus was also the seat of the Pan-Ionian Games, which the whole country came out to see. It was a very popular event. And so this made Ephesus a major tourist destination. But above and beyond these games, Ephesus was well known also for its great temple of Artemis. Artemis and Diana are one and the same. Artemis is simply the Greek name. Diana is the Latin name. It's the same goddess. This temple of Diana, if you will, was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. It was incredible. It was 425 feet long. It was 220 feet wide. It was 60 feet high, so 6 stories tall. There were 127 marble pillars that wrapped around the building, and each of those pillars was the gift from a different king. The image of Diana was pretty plain. The image of Diana was just a black, squat, mini-breasted figure, and she symbolized fertility. She was a goddess of fertility. This fertility goddess helped make Ephesus a center for pagan superstition. She was famous for charms, which helped guarantee safety on a journey. So people would come there to buy these charms and these amulets. And what these charms were supposed to do was they were supposed to guarantee safety on a journey. They were supposed to bring children to the childless. They were supposed to help bring success in love or in business enterprise. And so people came from all over the world to buy these magic parchments, which made Ephesus a great place to preach the gospel because people were coming from all over the world. And so in order to go into all the world, what better place to go than a place where people from all over the world were coming? So you could teach them, and so that when they left, they could go back home and share that good news with others. They would take and buy these magic parchments, though, and they made them as amulets, and they would buy the silver idols symbolizing Diana in their trip, during their trip. It's kind of like going to New York City and buying one of those little snow globes with the Statue of Liberty, right? That's kind of what it was like, going to visit the city of Ephesus and coming home with the silver goddess of Diana. Ephesus, though, was also the home of criminals. You see, any criminal who reached the area around the temple of Diana was granted the right of asylum. So if you were a criminal, on the most wanted list, and if you got near that court around the temple of Diana, then you were safe. And that made Ephesus a safe haven for criminals from around the world. And this is a city where Paul's preaching. A city that would be dangerous, a city that was full of idolatry, a city that was full of people who were worldly and wealthy and worldly minded. They were interested in sports and games and goddesses. And that made it a place that really needed the gospel. So Paul was there. He was preaching. However, just as the gospel came into Ephesus, and just as it began to have success in Ephesus, the people wanted to boot it out. So Paul starts having success a couple of years in. Many people are being persuaded. But some things happen in converting people to Christ. It started to affect the pocketbooks of the silversmiths and the shrine makers. The idol makers wanted the preaching of Christ stopped in Ephesus. Paul was converting people to Christ, and this conversion was leading them to give up on idolatry and their false gods, and it started to touch their pockets. So it's on the cusp of that situation, of that background, that this situation arises. We'll start reading about it here in Acts chapter 19, verse 21. After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem. That's just referring to Paul's future travel plans after he left Ephesus. He said, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. Paul really wanted to go to Rome. Hadn't been there yet. Now, that's another great place to go, the capital of the Roman Empire. You go there and you start winning people to Christ there, a place where people from all over the world were coming, then you can get people to take the gospel out to the rest of the world. So that's where Paul wanted to go. Paul wanted to go to places where he could have the greatest impact, the greatest influence. So Ephesus was one of those places. Rome would be another. Having sent into Macedonia, two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. Now about that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way, for a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. And these he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades. Paul's converting a lot of people. The beginning of Acts 19 is all about it. Paul's even making plans to go to other places so he can convert more people. And just as he's getting ready to make plans to leave and maybe go somewhere else, then this big chaos erupts, begun really by Demetrius, the silversmith. So that's the situation that we're in as we're in Ephesus. We want to go a little bit further, though. We want to take a look at the response of the idolaters. The response of the idolaters. Here's what it is. As you continue reading Acts 19, here's Demetrius. And some of this is a little bit of review from what we looked at this morning, but we're going to get into a little more detail with their response. Situation in Ephesus, again, is this. People were saying, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. That is what Paul was preaching. Paul was preaching that your gods, your little statues and shrines of Diana, they're not really gods. They're useless. They're just idols made with hands. They're not gods at all. Sorry. They're just chunks of metal that you fashioned. There is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence. Now think about that. We just described that temple of Diana, the temple of Artemis. He's saying not only are they insulting our trade, they're insulting our religion, and they're insulting really the centerpiece of our entire city, that temple. The very reason that many people come to visit Ephesus, he's insulting that. And he was. He was pointing out that this temple where people come to worship, they shouldn't be coming there to worship because Diana is not a goddess at all. She's not real. She's not living. She's just something fashioned with men's hands. She whom all Asia and the world worship. When they heard this, they were enraged. They were crying out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." So there's the situation. Let's take a look at the response. In verse 29, once they hear this news, once all these people who may very well have been silversmiths, but some of them may have been the criminals who had come to visit Ephesus. Those would be good people to rile up, wouldn't it? Get them going. I'd have enjoyed the chaos. In verse 29, the city was filled with confusion. They rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. I'm going to read verses 30 and 31 from my New King James Version here. When Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. Verse 31, then some of the officials of Asia who were his friends sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater. I don't know if they sent him a text message. I'm pretty sure they didn't. Somehow they got word to him, don't go in there, it's dangerous. Passed the message along to him. So he didn't go. Some therefore cried one thing, some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Well, then they draw Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hand and wanted to make his defense to the people. So here's somebody who wants to try to explain why it is they shouldn't be so angry, wanted to provide some reason and some logic to the crowd. But notice verse 34, when they found out that he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for about 2 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Let me tell you some of the response of the idolaters. Number one response, verse 28, is rage. When they heard this, verse 28 says, they were full of wrath, full of rage, cried out. It's a response. They're angry. The Bible says, be angry and don't sin. Be angry and sin not. But these people are full of rage. They're full of wrath. They're full of anger. They're mad. Not only is that the situation, but it says that the whole city was filled with confusion. Some people were saying one thing. Some people maybe didn't fully know or understand why everybody was in such a tizzy. But the city was filled with confusion. And that's kind of like what a riot's like. You got a lot of angry people, a lot of people who are mad, a lot of people who are shouting things, a lot of people who are confused, and a lot of people who are just there and don't really know why everybody's mad. But they want to kind of see the sights. And so these people are confused. These people in verse 32, they're shouting. It says, some therefore cry one thing, some another. So they're yelling out things. I don't know if they're yelling out vulgarities, if they're cursing, if they're making arguments, just yelling these arguments into the air. But I don't know about you, but when you have several people yelling at one time, you usually aren't getting much done. It's just a bunch of noise. And that's what it is here. People are just yelling, crying out. The assembly was confused. Most of them, listen to this, did not know why they had come together. That's the situation. We mentioned this morning, there's situations like that, right? Somebody gets in a fight at school. Everybody just gathers around. They don't really know why. You see that on the highway, right? Have you ever driven down a highway and you're stuck in traffic for a long time and you think there must be a really big accident up ahead? The accident's actually on the side of the road. It's not blocking traffic. You know why everybody slowed down? Because everyone wants to stop and see what's going on. They want to figure it out. And that's the way this situation, a lot of people are there. They just want to figure it out. Why is everybody yelling? Why is everybody mad? What's going on here? Notice what else is happening, though, in verse 34. There's stereotyping happening. Notice verse 34. When they found out that he was what? A Jew. Alexander comes forward. Alexander wants to speak, but this whole crowd, they have such a hatred towards Jews that they don't want to listen to him at all. Why? Not because what he's about to say isn't reasonable, not about what he's about to say might be very logical and wise and sensible, but because he's a Jew. And we don't want to listen to anybody who's a part of that religious party. Are people ever like that? You try to reason with them, you want to say something sensible, but no, you're this color. No, you're from this economic class. No, you're of this religion. No, you're part of this party. So we don't want to listen to you. It doesn't matter what you're going to say or what might come out of your mouth. They stereotype you and they classify you. If you're part of this, then we don't want to hear it. And that's what they've done with Alexander. So Alexander doesn't even get the chance to talk. It's going to take a heathen. It's going to take someone who is from Ephesus, who is not a part of this religious party, to speak up and to stand up and to say something to calm everybody down. And that's what we see happening with the town clerk. Alexander couldn't do it. I think Paul's brethren knew Paul wasn't going to come in there and do it. He was just going to get people more riled up. He was just going to make people mad. There was nothing he could say. And so they tell him, just go ahead and leave. Don't even come into the theater. Nothing good's going to happen here. Everybody's too angry. And so we see stereotyping, and then what do we see? We also see more screaming in verse 34. They found out that he was a Jew, and they all cry out for 2 hours. You ever tried to discuss with someone who tries to yell over you and scream over you? It's never a productive conversation, is it? And that's what they're doing. Whoever yells the loudest wins, I guess. That's some people's idea of a debate. Whoever can yell the loudest and interrupt you the most, that person, I guess, considers himself the better, but that doesn't really make for good conversation and good discussion and civil discourse. But that's what's happening here. They're in a riot and they're all just yelling and they don't want to hear any sound reason from anybody who might be on the other side. So that's their response. Take a look, though. The town clerk finally does get to speak, and we're going to read what he has to say here. It says in Acts chapter 19, and beginning in verse 35, we read about him beginning to speak. It says, when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, that took 2 hours. I guess they ran out of energy. I'd be tired after yelling for 2 hours, wouldn't you? So finally they quiet down, and he says this, men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis, and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? I told you earlier about that black, squatted, many-breasted figure, which was the image of Diana. They didn't really know who made that. They didn't know who carved it. They could tell you who carved and who donated every pillar on that building. There was an altar. There was a great, one of the greatest sculptors of that generation who had made that altar. But nobody knew where did that black statue of Diana had come from. They just believed that it fell from heaven. So that's why the town clerk says that. He says, and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky. Verse 36, seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. We're going to go through everything he says here. You have brought these men who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. And if therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open. And there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. Nothing's going to get settled in a riot. You're not going to really make any progress in a big, frenzied, chaotic riot. Mob of people screaming. Nothing's going to get done. He says, we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. And when he'd said these things, he dismissed the assembly. Now I want to think with you about the town clerk for a moment. The town clerk in Ephesus was more than that. This is what Barclay says in his daily study Bible series. He says that he kept the public records. That's what we think of when we think of the town clerk. But the town clerk also in Ephesus would have introduced business in the assembly. He calls the court to order, in a sense, introduces business. He also, correspondence to Ephesus was addressed to him. there was something that needed to be discussed among the governing authorities and body of Ephesus, then they addressed those things to him, and he shared those things with the people. He was worried here at the possibility of a riot. Perhaps he spoke up a little bit to save his own skin. Because if there is a riot, then Rome's not going to be very happy that one of their cities, Ephesus, is in a state of civil disorder. Rome was kindly, but the one thing she would not stand was civil disorder. I want to think with you about the wisdom of the town clerk in this situation. And when we are in situations like this, then we need people like the town clerk to speak up. Here's what he does. First of all, in verse 35, everybody's screaming, everybody's yelling, and he says this: everybody needs to be quiet and listen. We'd be a lot better served if instead of always spewing what we think and spouting off our opinions, sometimes we'd just shut our mouths and listen. James says, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. We don't always have to give everybody a piece of our mind. And he's telling them, be quiet and listen. That's good advice. You want to calm down, you want to bring peace to a situation where everybody is chaotic, then sometimes we just need to be quiet and listen a little bit. He says in verse 36, he says, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. There's a second piece of advice there. Don't make a rash mistake. Don't go flipping over people's cars. Don't go setting somebody's car on fire. Don't go out there and start throwing bottles through windows and throwing rocks at police officers. Don't start beating people up who you don't even know, you've never even talked to in your life. They're just driving by you and they look different than you. Don't do anything rash. Don't do anything that's going to cost you later in life and it's going to be harmful towards them. And so he says, hey, before this gets worse, everybody needs to calm down and don't do anything you're going to regret over this. Notice what else I think he does there in verse 37. He says, you have brought these men here, and they're not robbers of temples, and they're not blasphemers of your goddess. You brought these men here, and he says, basically, you're demonizing them. These people hadn't caused one little bit of disturbance. The only disturbance was that these people weren't making money off of them anymore. They weren't inciting violence. The Christians weren't. They weren't trying to get people to be harmful and hateful. They weren't calling people dirty names. They were just trying to preach to them what they thought was true. And so perhaps the idea there is that they have misrepresented them. Is that possible, that we do that with the other side? Sometimes, unfortunately, Don says, sometimes we exaggerate just a little bit and we start calling names and we start classifying them and putting them into categories that maybe they don't really belong. Maybe a few of them do. But we put everybody in that category. He says, hold on, these people haven't robbed your temple. Nobody's going to your temple and stealing stuff out of it. They're not trying to cart Diana under their elbow somewhere and sneak her out. None of that's happening. They haven't robbed anything. They're not hurting anybody. So you guys need to calm down. The ones that are about to hurt people are the ones in this big riot. You guys are the ones that are starting to cause a disturbance. That's the problem here. Then he says this in verses 38 and 39. Here's another piece of good advice. They're trying to handle things and take the law into their own hands. And the town clerk says, that's a no-no. You need to do things lawfully. There's a lawful way to handle your complaint. There's a lawful way to handle things that you really think might be violations of the law. And he says, and here's what it is. In verse 38, he's very specific. If Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen, if you have a case against someone, then go to court. Go to court. That's where it gets handled. Go to court. He says the courts are open. There are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. That's what the court system is set up for. That's one of the reasons we have government, so that issues like these can be settled, things that happen on earth. They settled in the courts. It's one of the reasons we have governing authorities. He says, but if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in the lawful assembly. This was an unlawful assembly. He says, if you got another problem, let's have a lawful assembly. Let's get together and we can talk about these things. But the way they were handling it was not the right way to handle things. And it was about to get worse. So the town clerk speaks up and he gives him some ways that he can take care of these things. Notice verse 40. Here's one more thing. Verse 40, he says, we are in danger of being called in question for today's uproar. There being no reason which we may give to account for this disorderly gathering. I think what he's saying there is, can we not bring shame upon ourselves and upon our city and upon our community? And that's what we do when we act rashly. There's video cameras all over the place now. It's easier for people to pick up a cell phone and record you doing something. And don't do something that's going to make you look like a fool. You know where employers look first today? Anybody who's kind of just halfway with 21st century people. You know where they look first? And when you fill out a job application and they're thinking about hiring, they go to your Facebook page. They go to your little Instagram if they can get a hold of it. They go to those social media sites. They want to see, does this guy have any common sense? And if they go there and they see videos of you at some drunken party acting a fool, there's a good chance you're not going to get hired. Don't do something that's going to bring shame on yourself. If you're working a job somewhere and you're out there at one of these riots and you're the one setting cars on fire, you're the one walking around without a shirt on, with vulgarities all over your body, holding up signs, there's a good chance you might get fired because you're acting like an idiot. Don't bring shame on yourself. And don't bring shame on your community. It's an embarrassment. So a lot of these cities, and somebody the other day said, I don't want to even go to Chicago. I'm scared to go there now. The murder rate's sky high. People are demonstrating. I'm afraid if I go there, I'm going to get beat up. You don't help your cities when you do things like riot and act crazy. You dissuade honest and good and paying people from wanting to go visit your town. They don't want to go there. They're scared. They're fearful. It hurts your reputation. It hurts your community's reputation. And we're not just talking about cities and communities either. We could be talking about churches just as easily. When you do things and lose your temper and just go off and fly off the handle, a lot of people think the same thing about the church. I don't want to be part of that church. Those guys are fussing and fighting and going nuts on each other, and then you display it publicly. It's an embarrassment to you and to whatever group you're a part of and you represent. Don't bring shame and reproach upon whatever you're a part of if you're a Christian. Finally, in verse 41, when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly, and the very simple point is this: go home. Don't you have families you need to be spending time with? You know, that's the problem, and I'm going to go off my soapbox in a minute. That's the problem with America. We're all talking about the government and this politician. The problem is the family in America. That we don't have moms and dads who are teaching their kids how to work and to be honest and to be good and to be decent people. That's what the problem is. What are these kids out here, 17, 18, 19 years old, doing in the middle of the night, rioting with a bunch of troublemakers? Mom and dad needs to tell their kids to come home. Get home. Be with the family. But too many kids are off on their own. They're independent. They have no oversight, no accountability. They're doing what they want. And that's a recipe for disaster in our country. When the home isn't right, it hurts the nation. It hurts the community. Go home. He says, go home. That's where you should be. Dads, raise your kids. Moms, raise your kids. Dads, go love on your wife. Moms, go take care of your husbands. Go home. Town clerk says, go home. So, what can we learn from this? Here's a simple thing I think we need to learn. As we think about situations, and I think it's pretty obvious what situations we can apply this to. I hope it is. But what is your goal? What is your goal? The goal of Paul. It was to win the lost to Christ. He didn't have to use coercion or blackmail. He didn't have to set things on fire to get his point across and win people to Jesus. That's not how he was winning people to Christ. And most Christians, that's not what they're doing. And those that are ought to be condemned. If you go out and you think that blowing up an abortion clinic and killing more people is the key to getting other people not to kill babies, that's not how it's done. It's done through winning people's hearts to Jesus through persuasion and through the logic and through the evidence that we have of Jesus with his word. And that's what Paul was doing. He's going to a town. He was trying to persuade people. He was opening up the scriptures. He was having civil conversation with people, trying to win them to Christ. He used evidence. He used persuasion. And this, in connection with man's free will, was leading to believers. The goal of his enemies was to use any means necessary to destroy Paul's cause. And so they used threats, they used intimidation, they used slander and lies and chaos to try to destroy Paul and the movement at that time that was Christianity. Their movement was sparked more by emotionalism, getting people's emotions stirred up and fired up about all of the bad that Paul was causing in this town, and exaggeration more than it was honest persuasion. Honest persuaders don't have to lie about other people to get their point across. But that's the means that they used. And the goal of the town clerk was to try and keep the peace between all citizens. That was his goal. His desire was a town that was at peace within itself. And here's the point that I want to make tonight, and that is, before you speak, before you post something on your Facebook, before you post something on your social media, before you try to throw that jab at your person who's of a different political persuasion or religious persuasion or whatever it is, before you post, before you speak, before you demonstrate, before you complain about something, I want to ask you, what is your goal? Is it just to make people angry? Is it just to incite more strife and more division? Just to make people mad? Just to gloat? Just to brag? What is your goal? Or is it to really win people's hearts to Christ? Because I can tell you, if your goal is a goal that is rooted in the works of the flesh, then you're not going to find spiritual success in that. The fruit of the Spirit, which is what we are to be displaying to a lost world with what we say and in how we say it and in who we say it to and in the moments in which we say it. The fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 22 is love, it is joy, it is peace. Love. Are you saying what you're saying with love? It's joy. Is the joy of being a Christian evident in your life? Are you full of hate? It's peace. Do you want to try to bring peace to the situation, or are you really fueling the fires of division even more? It's long-suffering. Do you realize that some people are going to say foolish things, and sometimes they just need to be ignored, and you just suffer through it? And you got to let it go. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, it's kindness. Do you realize other people are going to be unkind to you as a Christian when you take a stand for certain things, and yet you still need to be kind towards them? Fruit of the Spirit is kindness. Not lowering yourself to their levels. Goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, being gentle in how you say a thing, and self-control. Self-control. Against such there is no law. We need to be able to say things and speak things with love and with kindness if we're going to truly win people to Christ. You know, the great peace giver of all was Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. The apostle of Jesus Christ, Paul, once said in Romans chapter 12 and in verse 19, a verse that I think we'd be well to heed. In verse 19, he says, "Beloved, don't avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath." In verse 18, he says, "If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men." God wants us to try to live at peace with others and to overcome evil with good. That's exactly what Jesus tried to do. He's the Prince of Peace. He tried to conquer evil by his own love for mankind. He went and sacrificed himself on the cross. He was raised from the dead. And he sent his apostles to go out and to preach peace to people and goodwill towards men. Preaching peace to people was making them realize that through Jesus Christ, we could have peace with God. And through Jesus Christ, we could have peace with one another. In Jesus Christ, slave or free did not matter. And in Jesus Christ, Jew or Greek, your background did not matter. In Jesus Christ, male or female did not matter. In Jesus Christ, rich or poor does not matter. Your color does not matter. Your political party does not matter. In Jesus Christ, all those things that are in our past are put away. In Jesus Christ, we are all made one. In Jesus Christ, we all have one common past, and that is we've sinned. And through Jesus Christ, we all have one great hope, and that is the hope of heaven through the blood of Jesus Christ. Are you buried in Jesus Christ yet? When you're buried in Jesus Christ, all of your sin gets put in the past. And when you're buried in Jesus Christ, you're raised to walk in newness of life, given new hope, made now at peace with God and peace with man. And it is the hope of Jesus Christ we offer you as we extend this invitation. If you want to respond to it, you can come forward while we stand and while we sing.